Margaret Thompson had always prided herself on running the most exclusive country club in Riverside County. At 62, she carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that came from decades of looking down on others. Her perfectly styled, gray hair never moved out of place, and her designer clothes spoke of old money and older prejudices. The Riverside Country Club sat on pristine grounds overlooking the valley, its manicured lawns and pristine white buildings, a testament to tradition and exclusivity. Margaret had been the club's general manager for 15 years, and in that time she had carefully cultivated its reputation as a place where only the right kind of people belonged. On this particular Tuesday morning in March, Margaret was reviewing membership applications in her mahogany-paneled office when she noticed an unusual commotion near the main entrance. Through her window, she could see an elderly black man in his 70s walking slowly up the circular driveway. He wore a simple navy blazer over khaki pants, and despite his dignified bearing, something about his presence immediately irritated her. The man carried himself with quiet confidence, his silver hair neatly trimmed and his posture straight despite his age. What caught Margaret's attention most was the small American flag pin on his lapel, and the way other members seemed to step aside as he approached the entrance. She watched as he paused to help an elderly woman who had dropped her purse, his gentle smile and courteous manner only fueling her growing annoyance. Margaret had built her career on reading people, and something about this man's calm demeanor and the respectful way others treated him sent alarm bells ringing in her head. She had worked too hard to maintain the club's standards to let just anyone walk through those doors. The very thought of having to explain his presence to the board members made her stomach turn. Without hesitation, she rose from her leather chair and smoothed down her pencil skirt. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she strode through the lobby, her jaw set with determination. She had handled situations like this before, and she knew exactly how to make unwanted visitors understand they didn't belong. The man had just reached the main entrance when Margaret intercepted him, positioning herself directly in his path. Her arms crossed over her chest and her lips pursed into a thin line that had intimidated countless employees and visitors over the years. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice carrying the sharp edge of authority. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises immediately. This is a private club and you clearly don't belong here." The elderly man stopped and looked at her with patient eyes that held no anger, only a quiet sadness. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly and Margaret tensed, ready to call security. Instead, he pulled out a simple envelope. "Ma'am, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he said softly, his voice carrying the gentle cadence of the South. "I'm here for the Veterans Memorial Dedication Ceremony. I was invited by the club president himself." Margaret's eyes narrowed as she glanced at the envelope without taking it. She had heard nothing about any veterans ceremony, and even if there was one, she was certain it wouldn't include someone like him. Her voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of several members who were entering the club. "I don't care what kind of invitation you think you have," she declared loudly enough for others to hear. "This establishment has certain standards, and I won't have you disrupting our members' peaceful morning. Security will escort you off the property if you don't leave voluntarily." The man's shoulders sagged slightly, but his dignity remained intact. He carefully tucked the envelope back into his pocket and nodded slowly. "I understand, ma'am. I'll leave quietly. I wouldn't want to cause any trouble." As he turned to walk away, Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. She had handled the situation exactly as she always did, firmly and without compromise. The other members who had witnessed the exchange gave her approving nods, and she straightened her shoulders with pride. What Margaret didn't notice was the small group of younger club members who had watched the entire encounter from the side entrance. Their expressions ranged from shock to disgust, and several pulled out their phones to record the tail end of the confrontation. She also didn't see the distinguished gentleman in the expensive suit who had been walking toward the entrance and had stopped dead in his tracks when he recognized the elderly black man. As the old man made his way slowly back down the driveway, his head held high despite the humiliation, Margaret returned to her office feeling victorious. She had protected her club's reputation once again, and she was certain the board would commend her for her quick action. She settled back into her chair and returned to her paperwork, completely unaware that the man she had just dismissed was Staff Sergeant James Washington, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who had served 3 tours of duty and earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for his courage under fire. She had no idea that his invitation was genuine, or that his story of heroism had already begun to spread through social media, thanks to the young members who had witnessed her behavior. Margaret Thompson had just made the biggest mistake of her career, but she wouldn't realize it until tomorrow morning when her phone would start ringing with calls that would change everything. The next morning arrived with an unusual stillness that should have warned Margaret something was different. She arrived at the club at her usual time, 7:30 sharp, carrying her morning coffee and expecting another routine day of maintaining her carefully ordered world. The parking lot seemed unusually full for a Wednesday, but she attributed it to the beautiful spring weather. Her assistant, Jenny, was already at her desk when Margaret walked through the main entrance. The young woman's face was pale, and she clutched a stack of phone messages that seemed to grow thicker by the minute. The phone rang constantly, its shrill tone cutting through the morning quiet like an alarm. "Mrs. Thompson," Jenny said nervously, rising from her chair. "I've been trying to reach you since 6 this morning. We have a situation." Margaret set down her coffee with deliberate calm, though something in Jenny's tone made her stomach tighten. "What kind of situation? Has there been an accident?" Jenny handed her the stack of messages, her hands trembling slightly. "The phones haven't stopped ringing since yesterday evening. News stations, newspapers, social media influencers. They're all asking about what happened with that elderly gentleman yesterday." Margaret's blood ran cold as she scanned the messages. Channel 7 News, the Riverside Tribune, CNN, even Good Morning America had called. Each message contained variations of the same request. Comments about her treatment of decorated veteran James Washington at the country club. How do they even know about this? Margaret demanded, though deep down she suspected the answer. Those young members with their phones, always recording everything for their social media accounts. Jenny pulled up her laptop and turned the screen toward Margaret. The color drained from her boss's face as she saw a video that had been viewed over 2 million times in less than 18 hours. The caption read, "Country club manager kicks out decorated war hero. This will make you sick." The video showed Margaret's confrontation with James Washington from multiple angles, captured by at least 3 different phones. Her voice came through clearly as she dismissed him, her arrogant tone and dismissive gesture preserved forever in digital form. The comment section was filled with thousands of angry responses, and the story had been shared across every major social media platform. But that wasn't the worst of it. Jenny clicked on another tab, revealing a follow-up post that had gone even more viral. It was a photograph of James Washington in his military uniform from 1969, young and proud, standing with his unit in Vietnam. The post detailed his service record, 3 tours of duty, 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star with V device for valor, and a list of battles that read like a history of the Vietnam War. The caption explained that Sergeant Washington had been personally invited by the club president to speak at a Veterans Memorial dedication ceremony that was supposed to take place the following week. The invitation had been extended after the club learned that Washington had grown up in the area and had been denied membership decades earlier due to the club's racially discriminatory policies. Margaret felt the room spinning as she continued reading. The post went on to explain that Washington had never sought publicity or recognition for his service. He lived quietly in a modest apartment, volunteered at the local VA hospital, and had agreed to speak at the ceremony only because he hoped his story might inspire young veterans who were struggling with their own transitions back to civilian life. The phone rang again and Margaret jumped. Jenny answered it with the same apologetic tone she had been using all morning. "Riverside Country Club, please hold." She looked up at Margaret with frightened eyes. "That was the Today Show. They want to interview you this afternoon." Margaret sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Through the large windows of the main lobby, she could see news vans beginning to gather in the parking lot. Reporters were setting up cameras, and a small crowd of protesters had already assembled near the main entrance. The club president, Robert Hayes burst through the front doors at that moment, his usually composed demeanor replaced by barely contained fury. He was a tall man in his 70s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Margaret had always respected him, even feared him a little, but she had never seen him look as angry as he did right now. "My office, now," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had built a fortune in construction before retiring to enjoy the finer things in life. Margaret followed him on unsteady legs, aware that other club members were arriving, and staring at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust. The usual morning pleasantries were replaced by whispered conversations and disapproving glances. In his office, Robert closed the door and turned to face her. His face was red with anger, and his hands shook slightly as he held up his phone. "Do you have any idea what you've done? James Washington is not just any veteran, Margaret. He saved my son's life in Vietnam." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stared at Robert in disbelief as he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "My boy David was 22 when he stepped on that landmine. Sergeant Washington dragged him 300 yards through enemy fire to get him to safety. David lost his leg, but he came home alive because of that man's courage. When I found out James was living nearby, I personally invited him to speak at our memorial ceremony. I wanted to honor him properly, the way we should have 40 years ago." Margaret tried to speak, but no words came. The full magnitude of her mistake was beginning to dawn on her, and the weight of it was crushing. Robert's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "That man you humiliated yesterday is a hero, Margaret. And thanks to your ignorance and prejudice, the whole world now knows exactly what kind of place we've been running here." By noon, the situation had spiraled completely out of Margaret's control. The parking lot looked like a media circus, with satellite trucks from major news networks forming a semicircle around the club's entrance. Protesters carrying signs reading, "Honor our veterans and shame on Riverside Country Club," had grown from a handful to over 200 people. Margaret sat in Robert's office, watching through the window as her carefully maintained world crumbled before her eyes. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting for 2 o'clock, and she knew her career was hanging by a thread. What made it worse was that she was beginning to understand just how wrong she had been. Jenny knocked softly and entered, with another stack of messages. "Mrs. Thompson, I have some updates. The mayor's office called to say they're reviewing the club's tax exemptions and permits. The Riverside Tribune wants a statement by 3 o'clock for tomorrow's front page story and—" She hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "What else?" Margaret asked wearily. "Several major companies have canceled their upcoming events here. The Henderson wedding reception, the Morrison corporate retreat, and the annual charity golf tournament. They said they can't be associated with the club right now." Margaret closed her eyes and tried to calculate the financial losses. Those events represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue, money the club needed to maintain its operations and pay its staff. She was watching everything she had worked for disappear because of one moment of prejudice and pride. Robert returned from a series of phone calls looking even more grim than before. "I've been in damage control mode all morning," he said, settling heavily into his chair. "The board is furious. Half of them want to fire you immediately, and the other half want to understand how this happened before they make any decisions." He pulled up the viral video on his computer and forced Margaret to watch it again. Seeing herself through the eyes of millions of strangers was devastating. Her voice sounded harsh and cruel, her body language radiating arrogance and disdain. She looked like everything people despised about privilege and prejudice. "The worst part," Robert continued, "is that James Washington has refused to speak to any reporters. He's maintained complete dignity throughout this entire ordeal. When journalists asked him for comment, all he said was that he hoped this situation might lead to positive changes and better understanding between people." Margaret felt a stab of shame so sharp it was physical. Even after being humiliated and disrespected, the man she had dismissed was taking the high road, showing more class than she had ever possessed. "I need to fix this," she said suddenly, standing up from her chair. "I need to apologize to him personally. I need to make this right." Robert shook his head sadly. It's too late for a simple apology, Margaret. This has become bigger than just you and James Washington. This is about everything this club has represented for decades. The exclusion, the discrimination, the attitude that some people matter more than others. As if to emphasize his point, Jenny burst into the office without knocking, something she had never done before. Her face was flushed with excitement and fear. You need to see this right now. It's all over the news. She turned her laptop screen toward them, revealing a live news broadcast from outside the club. A reporter was interviewing a distinguished African-American woman in her 50s, someone Margaret didn't recognize, but who clearly commanded respect. That's Dr. Angela Washington, the reporter was saying. She's a trauma surgeon at Riverside Medical Center, and the daughter of Staff Sergeant James Washington, the veteran who was turned away from this country club yesterday. Margaret's heart sank further as she listened to Dr. Washington speak with calm professionalism about her father's service record and his quiet dignity in the face of discrimination. She talked about how her father had never spoken bitterly about the prejudice he had faced throughout his life, instead choosing to focus on helping other veterans and serving his community. My father didn't fight for his country so he could demand recognition or special treatment, Dr. Washington said to the camera. He fought because he believed in the ideals of equality and justice, even when those ideals weren't extended to him personally. What happened yesterday was unfortunate, but I hope it can become a teaching moment for all of us. The reporter then revealed another devastating piece of information. Dr. Washington had been the lead surgeon who had operated on Robert Hayes's grandson just 2 years earlier when the boy had been critically injured in a car accident. She had worked for 18 hours straight to save his life, never knowing the family connection to her father's military service. Margaret felt the room spinning as the connections became clear. This wasn't just about one moment of prejudice. This was about a web of relationships and history that she had been too blind to see. The Washington family had been quietly serving the community for decades, contributing in ways that Margaret had never bothered to notice or acknowledge. The news segment ended with footage of James Washington volunteering at the VA hospital, reading to patients and helping younger veterans fill out disability paperwork. His gentle smile and patient demeanor showed a man who had dedicated his life to service, both in uniform and out. Robert turned off the laptop and looked at Margaret, with something approaching pity. Do you see now? This isn't about political correctness or changing times. This is about basic human decency and respect. James Washington earned the right to be treated with dignity through his service to this country. But more than that, he earned it simply by being a human being. The weight of her actions was crushing Margaret now. She had spent so many years focusing on maintaining exclusivity that she had forgotten about basic humanity. She had become so concerned with keeping people out that she had lost sight of what should bring people together. Outside, the crowd was growing larger, and Margaret could see that many of the protesters were veterans themselves, some in wheelchairs, others walking with canes, all united in their support for one of their own who had been treated badly. The emergency board meeting convened at 2 o'clock in the club's private conference room, but the tension could be felt throughout the entire building. Margaret sat at one end of the polished mahogany table, facing 12 of the most influential people in Riverside County. These were the men and women who had built fortunes in real estate, technology, and finance, people who valued reputation above almost everything else. Board Chairman William Morrison, a stern man in his 80s who had founded the region's largest law firm, called the meeting to order. His voice carried the weight of decades in courtrooms, and Margaret had always found him intimidating even under normal circumstances. Margaret, he began without preamble. In 43 years of practicing law, I have rarely seen such a public relations disaster. We have members threatening to resign, corporate sponsors pulling their support, and the national media portraying our club as a symbol of everything wrong with exclusive institutions. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but her hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. I understand the situation is serious, but I was only trying to maintain club standards. I had no way of knowing who this man was. Board member Patricia Chen, a tech executive known for her sharp intellect, leaned forward. That's exactly the problem, Margaret. You assumed you knew who belonged here based solely on appearance. That kind of thinking went out with Jim Crow laws. Another board member, retired General Harrison Walsh, spoke up with barely contained anger. "I've reviewed Sergeant Washington's service record. This man has more medals than most generals. He volunteered for dangerous missions that others wouldn't take. While we were here playing golf and sipping cocktails, he was dodging bullets and saving lives in Southeast Asian jungles." Margaret felt smaller with each comment, but the worst was yet to come. Morrison pulled out a thick folder and opened it, deliberately. "We've received over 300 resignation letters since yesterday evening. That represents approximately 40% of our membership. More concerning, these aren't just ordinary members. These include our largest donors and most influential families." He read from a letter at the top of the stack. "This is from the Patterson family, who have been members for 60 years, and whose foundation has donated over $2 million to club improvements. They write, 'We can no longer be associated with an institution that treats American heroes with such disrespect and contempt. Our membership ends immediately.'" The financial implications hit Margaret like a sledgehammer. Without those membership dues and donations, the club couldn't survive. The staff would lose their jobs, the facility would close, and decades of history would be destroyed because of her actions. Morrison continued reading resignation letters, each one more damning than the last. Families who had celebrated weddings, anniversaries, and business deals at the club were walking away, unwilling to be associated with the discrimination they had witnessed. The Hendersons were particularly eloquent, Morrison noted. They pointed out that their own grandfather, who helped found this club in 1923, would be ashamed to see how we've treated a man who risked his life for American freedom. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the club's only African-American board member and a respected physician, had been quiet throughout the meeting. When she finally spoke, her words carried particular weight. "Margaret, I joined this board 3 years ago because I believed this club was ready to change, to become more inclusive and welcoming. Yesterday's incident proves we still have members of leadership who see people like me and Sergeant Washington as outsiders who don't belong." Margaret wanted to protest, to explain that she wasn't prejudiced, but the words died in her throat. Her actions had spoken louder than any explanation could. Morrison shuffled through more papers. "We've also received calls from the district attorney's office. While no laws were technically broken, they're reviewing whether the club's behavior constitutes discrimination that could affect our business license and tax-exempt status." The room fell silent as the full scope of the crisis became clear. This wasn't just about bad publicity anymore. The club's very existence was in jeopardy, and it was all because Margaret had made assumptions based on skin color rather than character. "General," Walsh leaned back in his chair and studied Margaret with the calculating gaze of someone who had commanded troops in combat. "The question now is whether this institution can be saved, and what role you'll play in that process." Margaret finally found her voice. "What do you mean?" Morrison answered for the general. "We've been in contact with Sergeant Washington through intermediaries. He's agreed to meet with club leadership to discuss a possible resolution, but he has conditions." Margaret's heart pounded as she waited to hear what those conditions might be. First, he wants a public apology, not just to him, but to all veterans who have ever been made to feel unwelcome at exclusive institutions. Second, he wants the club to establish a scholarship program for veterans' children. And third, he wants assurance that no one will ever again be judged worthy or unworthy of basic respect based on their appearance. Patricia Chen added, "He's also suggested that the club host a proper veterans memorial ceremony, one that honors all who served regardless of race, gender, or background. He wants to turn this negative situation into something positive for the community." Margaret was amazed by the man's grace and wisdom. Even after being humiliated, he was offering a path toward redemption rather than revenge. His conditions were reasonable and would actually strengthen the club's connection to the community. But there was one more condition that Morrison hadn't mentioned yet, and Margaret could see it in his expression. "There's something else," Morrison said gravely. "Sergeant Washington has made it clear that he'll only participate in this reconciliation process if there are guarantees that such discrimination will never happen again. The board has to decide whether the current management structure is capable of ensuring that guarantee. The following Thursday morning brought an unexpected twist that no one had anticipated. Margaret had spent the week in a state of suspended animation, waiting to learn her fate while watching the club hemorrhage members and revenue. The media attention had only intensified, with national news programs using the incident as a springboard for discussions about discrimination in private institutions across America. She was sitting in her office, clearing out personal items in preparation for what seemed like an inevitable termination, when Jenny knocked on her door with an expression of confused surprise. "Mrs. Thompson, you have a visitor," Jenny said hesitantly. "Sergeant Washington is here, and he's asking to speak with you personally." Margaret's blood ran cold. She had been dreading this moment all week, imagining the anger and condemnation she would face when she finally had to confront the man she had wronged. She had prepared speeches of apology, but none of them seemed adequate for the magnitude of her mistake. "Should I send him in?" Jenny asked. Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice. She stood up from her desk and smoothed down her skirt, trying to compose herself for what might be the most difficult conversation of her life. James Washington entered the office with the same quiet dignity he had displayed the week before, but something was different about his demeanor. He wore a simple gray suit and carried a small leather portfolio. His eyes held no anger, but there was a depth of sadness that made Margaret's heart ache. "Sergeant Washington," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you the most sincere apology. What I did was inexcusable, and I have no defense for my behavior." He gestured toward the chairs in front of her desk. "May we sit down, Mrs. Thompson? I'd like to have a conversation with you." They settled into the chairs, and Margaret waited for the rebuke she knew she deserved. Instead, Sergeant Washington opened his portfolio and pulled out several photographs, laying them carefully on the coffee table between them. "I wanted you to see these," he said softly. The first photograph showed a young James Washington in military fatigues, standing with his unit in what appeared to be a jungle clearing. His face was serious but proud, and despite his youth, there was already wisdom in his eyes. This was taken in 1969 during my second tour in Vietnam. I was 24 years old and thought I knew everything about courage and sacrifice. He pointed to several other young faces in the photo. 3 of these boys didn't make it home: Tommy Rodriguez, Billy Chen, and David Kowalski. We came from different backgrounds, different races, different parts of the country, but over there none of that mattered. We were just Americans looking out for each other. Margaret studied the photograph, seeing past the black and white image, to the young men who had volunteered to serve their country in an unpopular war. She began to understand that this wasn't just about one man being disrespected at a country club. Sergeant Washington showed her another photograph, this one of him, in a hospital bed with his arm in a sling and bandages covering part of his face. This was after the firefight where I pulled Robert Hayes' son to safety. I spent 6 weeks in that hospital, and you know what I thought about? I thought about coming home to a country where I could be treated with the same respect I'd shown my fellow soldiers. He paused and looked directly at Margaret. "But that's not what happened, was it? I came home to a country where people like you looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong, someone who wasn't worthy of basic courtesy." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea about your service, about what you had sacrificed. But that's just it, Mrs. Thompson," he said gently. "You shouldn't have needed to know about my service to treat me with respect. Every person deserves dignity, whether they're a decorated veteran or someone just trying to make an honest living." He showed her a third photograph, this one more recent, showing him with a group of young veterans at the VA hospital. Some were missing limbs, others showed the invisible wounds of psychological trauma, but all were smiling as they worked together on what appeared to be an art therapy project. "These are the veterans I work with now. Kids who came back from Iraq and Afghanistan carrying burdens no young person should have to bear. When I tell them about last week, do you know what they say? They say it's just more proof that their sacrifices don't matter to people like you." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but she forced herself to listen. She owed him that much. Sergeant Washington leaned forward in his chair. "I didn't come here to make you feel worse, Mrs. Thompson. I came because I believe people can change and because I think you might be genuinely sorry for what happened." Margaret nodded through her tears. "I am. I'm more sorry than I can express." "Good," he said, "because I have a proposition for you. The board has offered me your resignation as part of their apology, but I told them I wanted to speak with you first." Margaret looked up in surprise. She had assumed her firing was a foregone conclusion. "I don't want your job, Mrs. Thompson. What I want is for you to understand why what you did was so hurtful, and then I want you to help me make sure it never happens again." He pulled a final item from his portfolio, a handwritten letter. "This is from my granddaughter. She's 15 years old and wants to be a diplomat someday. She wrote this after watching the news coverage of what happened." Margaret took the letter with trembling hands and read the carefully written words. "Dear Mrs. Thompson, my grandfather taught me that everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes and become better. He says that's what makes America great. Not that we're perfect, but that we keep trying to be better. I hope you'll help him make sure other veterans never feel unwelcome again. Respectfully yours, Angela Washington, Jr." The simple grace of the letter, written by a teenager who had every right to be angry, broke something open in Margaret's heart. She realized that this family had been trying to teach her something about forgiveness and redemption that she had never learned in all her years of privilege. 6 months later, the Riverside Country Club looked very different from the exclusive institution it had once been. The parking lot was filled with a diverse mix of vehicles on this crisp October morning, from luxury sedans to modest pickup trucks, all belonging to people who had come to witness something unprecedented in the club's history. Margaret stood at the back of the crowd that had gathered on the main lawn, watching as final preparations were made for the Veterans Memorial dedication ceremony. The memorial itself was beautiful, a curved granite wall inscribed with the names of local service members from every conflict since World War I, surrounded by gardens planted and maintained by veteran volunteers. She hardly recognized herself in the woman she had become over the past months. Gone was the rigid posture and stern expression that had defined her for so many years. In their place was someone who smiled more easily, listened more carefully, and had learned to see people for who they truly were, rather than making assumptions based on appearance. The transformation hadn't been easy. After her conversation with Sergeant Washington, Margaret had faced a choice: resign in disgrace or commit to the hard work of personal change. She had chosen the harder path, working closely with the board and with Sergeant Washington himself to redesign how the club operated. The first change had been the most difficult for many longtime members. The club had opened its membership to veterans and their families regardless of financial status, with dues subsidized by a new foundation established with donations from members who supported the change. Some traditional members had left, but they had been replaced by families who brought new energy and perspectives to the club. Margaret had also insisted on undergoing sensitivity training, not because the board required it, but because she needed to understand how her unconscious biases had shaped her worldview. She had attended workshops on cultural competency, read books about the African American experience, and most importantly, spent time listening to people whose stories she had never bothered to hear before. The crowd quieted as the ceremony began. Robert Hayes stepped up to the microphone, looking dignified in his navy suit with a small American flag pin on his lapel, the same kind of pin Sergeant Washington had worn on that fateful day 6 months earlier. Today we dedicate this memorial not just to honor those who served, but to remember that the values they fought for, equality, justice, and respect for all people, must be lived out in our daily actions, Robert said, his voice carrying across the lawn. Margaret watched as Sergeant Washington approached the podium, moving slowly but with the same quiet dignity that had impressed her during their private conversation. He looked out over the crowd, which included not just club members but veterans from across the county, local dignitaries, and families from every background imaginable. When I first came to this club 6 months ago, I was turned away because someone made assumptions about who I was based on how I looked, he began, his voice clear and strong despite his age. Today, I stand before you not to dwell on that painful moment, but to celebrate what we've accomplished together since then." He gestured toward the memorial wall. "These names represent men and women who gave everything for the ideals of freedom and equality. They came from every background, every race, every economic level. They served together, fought together, and some died together. The least we can do is live together with the same respect and dignity they showed each other in foxholes and on battlefields around the world." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened to his words. She thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment, the public humiliation, the soul-searching conversations, the difficult work of changing not just policies, but hearts and minds. The ceremony continued with remarks from other veterans, including Dr. Angela Washington, who spoke about the importance of service both in uniform and in civilian life. Young veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan shared their stories, and children from the local elementary school sang patriotic songs with voices full of innocence and hope. When it came time to unveil the memorial, Sergeant Washington was joined by Margaret and several other club leaders. As the cloth fell away to reveal the beautiful granite wall, the crowd erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. But the moment that meant the most to Margaret came afterward, during the reception. She was standing near the buffet table when a young Hispanic veteran approached her. He was probably in his 30s with kind eyes and a prosthetic leg that he carried with obvious pride rather than shame. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Carlos Mendoza. I wanted to thank you for what you've done here. This place feels different now. It feels like somewhere I actually belong." Margaret shook his hand warmly. "Thank you for your service, Carlos, and thank you for giving me, a chance to do better." Carlos smiled and nodded toward where Sergeant Washington was surrounded by a group of children, patiently answering their questions about his medals. That man could have destroyed this place after what happened. Instead, he chose to help rebuild it into something better. That takes a special kind of courage. Margaret followed his gaze and watched as Sergeant Washington knelt down to the level of a young girl who was asking about his Purple Heart. His patience and gentleness with the children reminded her of how he had treated her during their difficult conversations, firm but kind, holding her accountable while still offering hope for redemption. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself in conversation after conversation with people she never would have met under the old system. She talked with Maria Santos, a nurse whose husband had died in Afghanistan, leaving her to raise 3 children alone. She met Robert Kim, a Korean War veteran who had been a successful engineer but had never felt welcome in exclusive social settings. She spoke with Jennifer Brooks, a young Marine who had served 2 tours in Iraq and was now studying to become a teacher. Each conversation taught her something new about service, sacrifice, and resilience. These weren't just names on a membership roster or faces in a crowd. They were individuals with rich stories, deep dreams, and experiences that had shaped them in ways Margaret was only beginning to understand. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the memorial garden, Margaret found herself standing alone with Sergeant Washington near the granite wall. Most of the crowd had moved inside for dinner, but they remained outside, both lost in their own thoughts. "I never properly thanked you," Margaret said quietly. "Thanked me for what?" he asked, genuinely surprised. "For not giving up on me, for believing I could change when I wasn't sure I believed it myself." Sergeant Washington smiled, the same gentle expression she had seen him wear with the children earlier. "Mrs. Thompson, I learned something important during my time in Vietnam. The easiest thing to do when someone hurts you is to write them off as a bad person and walk away. The harder thing is to believe they can become better and help them get there." He gestured toward the memorial wall where the last rays of sunlight were illuminating the engraved names. These men and women didn't fight for a perfect country. They fought for a country that had the potential to become better. That's what I see in you, in this club, in all of us. We're not perfect, but we're trying to be better. Margaret nodded, understanding finally that this wasn't just about one woman learning to overcome her prejudices. It was about the ongoing work of building the kind of society that honored the sacrifices made by generations of service members. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we keep doing the work," Sergeant Washington replied. We keep having difficult conversations, keep challenging our assumptions, keep opening doors that were previously closed, and we teach the next generation to do better than we did. As they walked back toward the club building, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been focused on exclusion and maintaining barriers. Now she was part of something larger, a community that celebrated service, embraced diversity, and worked actively to ensure that every person was treated with dignity and respect. The Riverside Country Club still hosted elegant events and maintained beautiful grounds, but it had become something more meaningful than just an exclusive retreat for the wealthy. It had become a place where veterans could find community, where families from different backgrounds could build friendships, and where the values of service and sacrifice were honored not just in words, but in daily actions. Margaret's unexpected visit from Sergeant Washington had indeed changed her life forever, but not in the way she had initially feared. Instead of destroying her world, it had opened her eyes to a larger, more beautiful world than she had ever imagined possible. The lesson she learned, that true dignity comes not from excluding others, but from including them, would guide her for the rest of her days. And every morning when she arrived at the club, she would pause at the memorial wall to read the names of those who had served, reminding herself that their sacrifice called her to be worthy of the freedom and opportunities they had died to protect.